let's talk a little bit about kind of how, when you're talking about brain wiring, we want to talk about, when we talk about speed, a lot of times we want to talk about kind of working memory. Can you tell us about what is working memory and how does that impact, the speed with which we learn?
So working memory is as a rough quantitative idea, it's the amount of information you can hold consciously in mind and manipulate things with. So normally people can hold about 4 pieces of information in mind. And I know you're probably saying, well, what do you mean by pieces of information? It can mean lots of different things. If you know something really well, then you can hold big clumps of information in your mind. If you don't know something very well at all, you can hold little clumps of information in your mind. So, for example, you could probably hold your phone number, quickly hold your phone number, your street address, maybe a friend's birthday or your birthday. You can hold each of these, even though there are a lot of numbers, you could hold each of them in mind, kind of almost consciously, and say them all consecutively, but you can't do the same number of numbers, right? If they were just random numbers. So what this really means is if you know something already, it can help you build much more easily in the new learning you're doing.
What's kind of like schema, right? Like the idea of if you can apply a schema, like I love that you're actually mentioning strings of numbers. One of the things I talk about with my students is think about phone numbers, right? For all of us on this conversation, we remember a day where we had to remember phone numbers. Now, back in our day, probably it was 7 digits, right? Now, at some point in time, we had to pick up area codes. That was 10. And I talked to students about how we had to learn these numbers and we were able to make sense of them by scheme of like, well, I know you live in a certain city, so I know there's going to be a certain 3-digit area code, or I know that 3-digit interchange is only related to certain particular cities, where once you start to do that, then it might become, you only really have to remember the last 4 digits, right? So I think, is that what you're speaking of, this idea of how our minds try to process or organize information?
That's exactly it. But more than that, what does this have to do with fast and slow learners? So it turns out that fast learners, I like to think of your working memory as like an octopus. And some people have octopuses with lots of arms. In other words, they can hold lots of pieces of information in mind at once. Others can hold only a little information. So on average, people can hold about 4 pieces of information. People who can learn really, really fast can hold like 9 or 10 or more pieces of information in their mind at once. Whereas someone like me, who's a slower learner, I can hold about 3 pieces of information in mind at once. But here's the trick. It doesn't matter if your working memory is big or little, if you have already learned the material really well and built a schema that you can draw from in your long-term memory.
Right.
And that's the thing. It can take a slower learner like me who has a lesser capacity working memory. Think about it. If I only have 3 arms, I take a ball of information, I put it in my brain, so to speak, metaphorically. Well, I've only got 3 arms. So I can only put so much, it's like this really small funnel, whereas someone with 10 arms, they can put stuff in a lot more quickly. But when I get that stuff in there, it connects together and forms a large like unit or schema of information. And I can easily draw even really complex information into my working memory, even though my working memory is actually rather limited because I've already knit that together, that information together in my long-term memory. So the trick for helping those with lesser capacity working memory, in other words, slower learners, is to scaffold that information and give them more opportunities for practice.
So what I'm getting here is we're saying fast and slow learners, but we're kind of talking about how many pieces of information a learner can manage at a time. But you're talking about the other piece of the process, which is the retention and
Right.
the building of the model. So how is it, you know, you've alluded to this before, that people can think they're learning when they're not. How do learners or how do students fool themselves into thinking that they're learning?
So this can happen whether you are a fast learner with a large capacity working memory or a slow learner with a lesser capacity. You look at a page and it is in your temporary sort of visual sketch pad. So it's a visual spatial sketch pad. It's right there. If you close your eyes, you can still see it for a few seconds. But students will look on the page and say, I know it. It's in my long-term memory, when it actually is not.
And that is the illusion of knowledge, right? The notion, students will say, I knew that. And you want to say, and I always kind of have to sort of temper it, like, but you don't know it. So saying you do, but there's this idea of recognition does not mean like knowledge or retention, right? That's sort of sometimes with students, I try to distinguish, just because you're familiar doesn't mean you know it and you can access it or use it or certainly apply it.